equipment. I will make a comment on this in a while. On the external sector, performance in the first half was as follows. Preliminary data indicates that as at end June 2023, the merchandise trade surplus narrowed to just about $0.02 billion from $1.7 billion in the corresponding period in 2022. So the gap between exports and imports is narrowed very substantially, and this is explained by growth in imports. We see growth in imports in of course, some of this is fertilizers, petroleum products, and so forth. But also, we are beginning to see more and more importation of equipment and machinery, especially in the manufacturing sector, which is something that you would expect to see when an economy is poised to have greater growth or higher growth. Imports rose by 23.1%, and as I said, this was less. This rise in imports is a big change from what we saw last year. Copper export earnings decreased by 22.6% to $3.4 billion from $4.4 billion last year, due to the factors in the copper industry that I mentioned earlier on. Gross international reserves as at end March 2023 declined to $3 billion from $3.1 billion, but this too gave us 3.3 months of import cover, which is, I think, quite still adequate. Of course, last year this time we had 3.8 months of import cover, but 3.3 is still reasonably acceptable. As I close, the 2024 budget preparations is now underway following the publication of the medium-term budget plan. I urge all of you to take keen interest and submit your proposals on revenue mobilization, expenditure prioritization, and indeed economic policies for consideration by the government. Our aim, our aspirations is to push very hard for economic growth. The slowdown in the economic growth that I just mentioned notwithstanding, we have to push very hard for economic growth to rise, because this is where jobs will come from. This is where more tax revenues will come from, and we are basically ready to listen to any proposals that assist in job creation. So our agenda now and in the next few years, having secured debt relief, having secured macroeconomic stability, the agenda now is to push for growth and jobs. Push for growth and jobs. This is the agenda that we have. So those with specific proposals on how this can be achieved, of course, we do have the issues that I talked about in the mining sector, the rationalization of the taxes so that we are competitive, and as I speak right now, they to rise. Agriculture, we are pushing very hard. Right now, as we speak, the D-compound fertilizer fertilizers. The D compound fertilizers have been promising season like what I've received. The Lusaka South Multi-Facility Economic Zone now is fully committed for the manufacturing sector. Fully committed, people have taken up all the space. We expect to see more investments taking place, but we want to do more. This is why we are planning to make the conditions under the M-phase as attractive as possible. Let me stop here, and then my colleagues will complement to what I've said. Thank you so much indeed for your listening.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. There we are, information on
2023. And the increase basically was necessitated by the need to finance the budget. As you are aware, that budget financing due to the default on debt and no money coming from most of the creditors, apart from the IMF, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank, we needed to rely on the domestic markets to finance the budget. In terms of the debt restructuring process, I just wanted to give you some milestones, and we are aware the minister did present a ministerial statement in the National Assembly, but just to remind ourselves that this process started in May 2020, where there was an application for a temporal debt service suspension under the G20 debt service suspension initiative, and in November 2020, we defaulted on the 452 million payment of Eurobonds. And after we defaulted on Eurobonds, this then became public because initially we had already started defaulting on some of the Chinese debt. But I think with the Chinese, they never went public because they believed in some diplomatic channels, and we are still looking at how best we could handle that. In February 2021, we made an application to the G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatment Beyond the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. And in June 2022, there was a formation of the Creditor Committee. In June 2023, as the minister did indicate, we had reached an agreement with the Official Creditor Committee, and based on reaching the agreement with the Official Creditor Committee and the IMF therefore reviewing the program, we managed to get the second tranche of the 7 tranches that the IMF committed under the ECF program that we have with the IMF. We got the first tranche in August 2022 after we had the financing assurances from the Official Creditor Committee, and we got the second tranche in July 2023, meaning we are remaining with 5 tranches should we meet the commitments or the benchmarks that we have made under the program. And every 6 months, the IMF will review the program and they will be able to release the tranche around the same amount every 6 months. In terms of what this Official Creditor Committee agreement means for Zambia, one is that approximately $5.8 billion in debt service savings will be realized between 2023 and 2031. 2 is that we will now pay around $750 million in the next 10 years, as opposed to $6.3 billion that was due and we are supposed to pay during this period. This therefore means that there will be some fiscal space that will be used. One, that instead of us going to borrow more and therefore increasing the debt service, in one of the presentation I was making, I was showing that in 2006, we were only paying $86 million as debt service per year. That figure increased to $1 billion by 2019. That figure, if we were to service the debt today without the restructuring, would have been paying $2.2 billion. So between 2013 and 2021, we went and borrowed more money to run the budget, and because we borrowed more money, it meant that we had to provide more money to service the debt, and that's how debt service increased from $86 million to $2.2 billion by the end of 2022. And because we defaulted in 2020 and we didn't service that debt, we had arrears that we were supposed to pay of $4.6 billion by first quarter of 2023. So by March 2023, we should have paid $4.6 billion. And if it wasn't for the common framework and the initiative for which we have been accepted, it would have meant that any of the creditors that we owed part of that money would have taken us to court and would have lost the case. And after losing the case, it would have meant that the entire $14 billion that we owe the international creditors would have become due and payable. That is what happened in Zimbabwe in the 80s. And up to now, Zimbabwe is struggling because they failed to service the debt. It became due and it became payable immediately. In terms of the next steps, following the reaching of the agreement in June, we are now negotiating a memorandum of understanding with the official creditor committees, and I know someone will ask a question, why has it taken so long? Ordinarily, for our colleagues in the West, July and August are summer holidays. Schools close, almost everyone goes on leave for their summer holidays. But we have since resumed and we are having the discussions and we're hoping to reach agreement very soon. And once we sign that memorandum of understanding, then we'll go and have bilateral agreements with official creditors signed based on the memorandum of understanding that we have signed, or based on the terms of the memorandum of understanding that we have signed with the official creditor committee. We have continued to engage the private creditors, including the bondholders, on a non-disclosure agreement basis, and we have had preparations and will be meeting most of the private creditors in the month of September to try and reach agreement on the terms as established in the MOU that we'll be signing with the official creditors. We are also engaging with the bondholders with a view to reaching agreement on the same terms. So that is the process that we are in, and it's a busier process for us, especially in September, as we prepare for the 2024 budget. We also need to make sure that we move on this aid. Let me end here and conclude by saying that the Zambian economy has the potential to grow, except it has been suppressed by the burden of their sustained debt for far too long. And again, I was sharing with the permanent secretaries here in Mungushi when we were having the budget hearing for 2024, and I was telling them, and I showed them a graph that demonstrated the growth potential or trajectory that we undertook from 2006 to 2013, growing the economy or the GDP from $12.7 billion to $28.1 billion. And if we took that growth and we showed the path, the growth path, it showed that the economy was growing by $2.2 billion every year from 2006 to 2013. And then we demonstrated that if we had continued on that growth path, our GDP would have been around $52.3 billion for 2024. And at $52.3 billion, it would have meant that if we wanted a budget of 26% of GDP, which we are trying to propagate as we demonstrate, as we provided in the medium-term expenditure framework 2024-2026, it meant that our budget converted, and if I did a simple conversion at 20 kwacha per dollar, would have been 272 billion. The budget that we can get from the 26% of GDP in 2024 at the GDP of 34 billion and not 52 billion would just be around 170 billion. It would have meant that we would have had an extra 100 billion for us, extra 100 billion kwacha for us to invest in infrastructure, in education, and in health, and in water and sanitation to grow our economy. So we need to make sure that we go on that trajectory. As the minister presented, we have seen that we are getting back. We have the macroeconomic stability once more, and we are getting back on the economic growth trajectory that we had emphasized in the Vision 2030, and that if we proceed and continue on this trajectory, we will realize our vision, probably not 2030, but we can extend with some years and we'll be able to realize our vision. Government will ensure that it expedites